Welcome to Hardscript.
I didn't hear it from her. I heard it from her friend. We were at a rooftop mixer hosted by one of her agency clients. The kind of place where everyone pretends the view matters more than who's watching who. I stayed near the edge, phone in hand, answering messages from a freight partner on the West Coast. That was my role in her world lately. Present, useful, quiet. She was across the terrace, glowing in that practiced way she used when she wanted attention without looking like she needed it. 2 steps behind her stood Evan, the guy I'd openly written off more than once. A small-time influencer who treated life like a camera was always on and consequences were optional. I'd told her months ago he was unreliable, hollow, dangerous to keep around. She'd smiled and said I was overthinking it. I turned slightly when I heard my name float over the music. Her friend leaned in close to her ear, careless, confident no one important was listening. She told her to call it a break. Said to watch me collapse. They laughed. Not loudly. Comfortably. I didn't react. My hands didn't shake. My face didn't change. I finished the message on my phone, hit send, and locked the screen. The contract went through. Trucks would roll by morning. Across the terrace, Evan touched her lower back like it was already his place to do so. She didn't move away. That was the point. It wasn't desire. It was placement. A deliberate choice of someone I didn't respect, positioned exactly where it would sting if I were still playing the role she expected. She glanced over, checking for damage. I gave her nothing. When she finally approached, it wasn't urgent. She spoke like someone delivering a line she'd rehearsed with witnesses in mind. She said maybe we needed space. She said a break could be healthy. She said it without fear, already picturing my reaction. I nodded once. Calm. Agreeable. She paused, confused by the absence of resistance. She waited for questions, for bargaining, for emotion. None came. I told her to take whatever time she needed and stepped away to greet a shipping executive I'd been meaning to meet. Behind me, I felt her attention sharpen. This wasn't how the scene was supposed to go. Later that night, while she slept at home, I sat at the kitchen counter and opened a folder I'd prepared weeks earlier. Accounts, entities, exit clauses, quiet adjustments waiting for a signal. The break was hers. What happened next was already mine. The morning after the break announcement, nothing changed on the surface. She moved through the apartment like she always did, confident in the pause she'd created. She believed distance was a lever, and that I was still attached to the machinery. I left early and drove to the warehouse district, not because I had to, but because patterns reveal things when you don't interrupt them. By midday, I was sitting across from Mark, a regional operations manager who'd worked with me for years. He didn't ask about my marriage. He never did. He slid a tablet across the table instead, open to a logistics dashboard I hadn't requested. He mentioned, casually, that my wife's name had come up at a networking event the previous evening. Said it lightly, like trivia. He said she'd been with Evan. Not just present. Attached. Comfortable enough to introduce him as someone close. Mark didn't accuse. He didn't speculate. He just described what he saw, the way men in my field always do. Clean facts. No tone. I nodded and handed the tablet back. The numbers were solid. Routes optimized. Margins intact. That mattered more in that moment than anything he'd said, and he noticed. He always noticed. On the drive back, my phone buzzed with a notification from a shared calendar. She'd added a vague entry for herself later in the week. Something social, something new. She hadn't bothered hiding it. That was part of the experiment. She wanted reaction data. I didn't respond. That evening, she told me she might stay out. She said it like someone testing a boundary, watching for resistance. I told her to do what felt right. My voice stayed level. Neutral. Her eyes narrowed, not in suspicion yet, but in irritation. This wasn't the script. The break was supposed to create chaos. Silence was supposed to feel like pressure. Instead, the apartment felt oddly stable, like something had already been removed without her noticing. Later, alone in my office, I opened a different file. Not financial. Personal. A timeline I'd quietly been updating for months. Travel overlaps. Social media gaps. Subtle shifts in spending patterns routed through accounts she assumed I never reviewed. Evan's name appeared more than once. It wasn't the affair that registered. It was the choice. She'd selected him because she knew what I thought of him. Because she wanted the contrast to do the damage for her. That told me everything I needed to know. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask for clarity. I confirmed something far more useful. The break wasn't a pause. It was permission. She grew lighter in the apartment after that. Less careful. The break gave her a sense of moral clearance, as if redefining the word erased the behavior attached to it. She stopped explaining where she was going. She stopped checking whether I was watching. That was the tell. I stayed consistent. Same departures. Same returns. Same calm tone. The absence of friction made her bolder. By midweek, patterns tightened. Her phone stayed face down more often. Notifications appeared, then vanished. She began showering the moment she got home, even when she hadn't been out long. None of it was dramatic. It was procedural, like she was following a workflow she'd tested before. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. During lunch at a quiet restaurant near one of my distribution hubs, I met with a compliance attorney I'd used years earlier for a partnership dispute. He thought we were discussing a potential acquisition. That wasn't untrue. It just wasn't complete. He explained, in neutral terms, how shared assets behaved under separation when one party assumed cooperation would continue. He explained timing, visibility, control. He spoke carefully, like someone who knew I wasn't there for reassurance. I thanked him and paid in cash. That afternoon, I rerouted revenue from 2 joint-facing accounts into an operational buffer she'd never interacted with. Not hidden, just repositioned. By evening, automated alerts confirmed the changes had settled without triggering attention. At home, she moved through the space like a guest who still believed it belonged to her. She mentioned Evan in passing, testing the name aloud, watching my reaction through reflections and pauses. She framed it as coincidence, as networking, as something temporary. I gave her nothing. Later, while she slept, I reviewed social media metrics from Evan's public profiles. Engagement spikes, location tags, familiar backgrounds. He documented his life obsessively, incapable of restraint. That was his weakness. He broadcasted what others concealed. The confirmation came quietly. A tagged photo from someone else's story, a blurred edge of her jacket, a caption about late nights and real connections. I closed the app. It wasn't anger that moved me forward. It was alignment. Everything she'd done lined up with the version of her I'd been slowly noticing but hadn't named. The strategist, the provoker, the person who needed reaction to feel in control. She believed the break gave her leverage. What it actually did was remove the last reason I had to explain myself. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. In the morning, I began executing the next phase, knowing she still thought the story was about distance. She didn't realize it had already shifted to replacement. She noticed the first change without understanding it. The joint credit card stopped pinging with approval alerts tied to my routes. The household account still worked, groceries cleared, utilities paid, but the larger movements she'd grown used to simply weren't there anymore. She didn't mention it. She assumed it was temporary. She assumed I'd explain when she pushed. Instead, I became harder to locate. Not physically. I still slept in the apartment some nights. I still answered messages about practical things. But the rhythm shifted. I no longer adjusted my schedule to overlap with hers. Meetings extended. Dinners ran late. I stopped narrating my day. The space she'd relied on to read me went quiet. She tested that silence by escalating elsewhere. Her presence online sharpened. Stories posted with intention. Locations chosen for visibility. Evan appeared more openly now, his arm occasionally visible, his laugh bleeding into the background of clips. It was all framed as casual, effortless. She wanted the optics to travel back to me through mutuals without her having to say anything directly. They did. An acquaintance from the agency reached out under the pretense of business and mentioned seeing her around town with someone new. He tried to sound neutral. He failed. I thanked him and redirected the conversation back to work. That evening, she brought it up herself. Not the affair. The distance. She said I seemed distracted. She asked if I was okay with the break continuing like this. The question was designed to pull me into negotiation, to make me confirm I was still emotionally invested. I told her I was adjusting. That was all. Her reaction was immediate but contained. She smiled too quickly. She nodded as if reassured, but her eyes lingered, searching for the edge she needed to feel relevant. It wasn't there. Later, alone, I finalized the separation of our shared obligations. Vendor contacts updated. Authorizations reassigned. Access permissions quietly revised. The system responded the way systems always do when changes are clean and intentional. Outside, she was accelerating toward what she thought was a finish line. Inside, she was losing position without realizing the race had changed. The disappearance everyone expects is dramatic. Doors closing, phones unanswered, public exits. Mine was different. I stayed visible. I just stopped being reachable in the ways that mattered. And that confused her more than absence ever could. Evan began to feel permanent to her. That was the shift she didn't question. He showed up reliably enough to reinforce the story she was telling herself, and unpredictably enough to keep her alert. He fit the role she'd assigned him. Accessible, loud, disposable if needed. What she didn't consider was how people like him move through the world. In my business, reliability isn't about personality. It's about patterns under pressure. Evan had none. He treated obligations like suggestions and exposure like currency. That combination leaves traces everywhere. I didn't reach out to him. I didn't need to. His own footprint did the work. A logistics client I'd stopped pursuing months earlier resurfaced through a back channel, asking vague questions about a promotional partnership. They mentioned Evan's name casually, like it was already attached to the deal. I let the conversation unfold. I asked nothing. I simply listened. It turned out Evan had been leveraging proximity to my wife to inflate his credibility, dropping names, hinting at access, suggesting future collaborations he had no authority to promise. He was selling an image he didn't own. I passed the information along to the client's legal team, framed as a precaution. No accusation, no urgency, just documentation. Screenshots pulled from public posts, timestamped statements. Enough to prompt a review without pointing back to me. The fallout wasn't immediate. It never is when things are done quietly. A few days later, Evan's online tone shifted. Less confidence, more defensiveness masked as humor. He posted vague messages about people misunderstanding boundaries and business getting too corporate. Engagement dipped. Invitations slowed. At home, she felt it before she understood it. Her energy sharpened. She checked her phone more often. Her laughter thinned. She started asking questions that weren't about me, but were meant to be overheard. She needed reassurance from somewhere. She didn't connect it to Evan yet. She still believed she was controlling the board. One evening, she mentioned that he seemed stressed. She said it like an observation, but it landed as a probe. I acknowledged it without curiosity. I said people like that burn fast. She bristled, defended him. Too quickly. That was the first crack. The structure she'd leaned on wasn't collapsing dramatically. It was losing integrity, one quiet compromise at a time. Sponsors pulled back. Calls went unanswered. The version of him she'd chosen to hurt me with began revealing its actual weight. I didn't celebrate. I didn't push. I watched. Because the most effective moves don't announce themselves. They wait for gravity to finish the job. The shift became visible to other people before she admitted it to herself. It happened at a small industry dinner she insisted we both attend, the kind built around round tables and polite ambition. She arrived confident, dressed for attention, already scanning the room for validation. Evan wasn't there. He hadn't been invited. That alone irritated her more than she expected. I stayed composed. I spoke with colleagues. I listened more than I talked. The difference between us that night was subtle but unmistakable. She needed eyes on her. I didn't. Midway through the evening, one of her peers leaned in too close while speaking to her. The tone was friendly but edged with curiosity. I saw her posture change, the slight stiffness that appears when someone senses judgment approaching. The woman mentioned, almost casually, that people were confused. That things seemed complicated lately. That visibility without clarity made narratives travel faster than intended. It wasn't an attack. It was a warning delivered as gossip. Across the table, someone else asked me how the business was adapting this quarter. They referenced a structural change I'd made quietly, one that hadn't been public knowledge yet. The question implied awareness. It implied movement. I answered calmly. Briefly. I didn't look at her. She noticed. Her smile tightened. For the first time, she realized she wasn't the most informed person in the room. Later, while guests mingled, she stood alone near the bar, phone in hand, refreshing feeds that no longer reassured her. Conversations continued around her, but none included her directly. No confrontation. No exclusion she could point to. Just a collective reorientation that didn't wait for her permission. Someone nearby remarked that things always come out eventually, said with a shrug, not directed at anyone in particular. It landed anyway. On the way home, she was quieter than usual. Not reflective, calculating. She was replaying interactions, searching for the moment control slipped. She still didn't see it clearly, but she felt the imbalance. At home, she asked if people had said anything to me. The question was framed lightly, but urgency leaked through. I told her nothing had come up. That wasn't a lie. She watched me closely after that, not with suspicion, but with something closer to alarm. The social environment she curated so carefully was no longer responding on command. The reactions she depended on were delayed, diluted, redirected. She had wanted a spectacle. What she got instead was distance multiplied by witnesses. And for the first time, she couldn't tell who they were watching anymore. Her world narrowed faster than she expected. It wasn't dramatic. No doors slammed. No public fallout. The invitations simply became selective. The casual check-ins slowed. People she used to call without thinking began taking longer to respond, if they responded at all. She blamed algorithms at first, then schedules, then coincidence. But coincidence doesn't repeat itself with precision. Evan stopped being useful around the same time. His stress had curdled into resentment. He complained more. About money. About missed opportunities. About people who didn't recognize his value. He needed reassurance she was no longer willing to give, because reassurance requires belief. She came home restless. She moved through the apartment without purpose, opening the fridge, closing it, checking her phone, setting it down. The silence bothered her now. Not because I was absent, but because I was present without engagement. I still handled logistics. Still paid what needed paying. Still showed up when necessary. But I no longer filled space. I didn't ask how her day went. I didn't react to her stories. I listened with the same neutral attention I gave vendors explaining delays. She tried to pull me back in indirectly. She mentioned feeling alone. Not accusing. Just stating it. As if proximity alone should trigger concern. I acknowledged it and returned to my work. She waited for more. It didn't come. Later, she attempted warmth. Small gestures. Familiar habits she'd once relied on to reset tension. They landed without friction, slid off without resistance. That confused her more than rejection would have. One evening, she asked if I was still in this. The phrasing was careful, ambiguous enough to retreat if needed. She wanted reassurance without vulnerability. I told her I was where I needed to be. That answer followed her for days. She began staying out less. Not because things improved, but because there was nowhere else that felt stable. Evan's circle had thinned. Her professional space felt colder. Home was quiet in a way she couldn't influence. She started watching me when she thought I wasn't aware. Studying routines. Trying to detect signs of anger, pain, longing. Anything that suggested she still had leverage. What she found instead was consistency. The isolation wasn't imposed. It was revealed. Every structure she'd leaned on required reaction to function. And reaction was the one thing I'd removed completely. By the time she understood that, she was already standing alone inside a system that no longer revolved around her. And I was right there, just not reachable. The confrontation didn't come the way she'd planned it. There was no raised voice. No accusation she could counter. It happened in the quiet space between routine and realization, when she finally understood that indirect pressure wasn't working anymore. She waited until we were alone and still, the apartment unusually calm. She positioned herself across from me, not blocking the exit, not sitting too close. She'd learned by then that overt moves failed. This was meant to feel reasonable, controlled. She said we couldn't keep living like strangers. She said the break had gone on long enough to evaluate. She said she needed to know where I stood. I listened without interrupting. I didn't look away. I didn't lean in. I let the silence stretch after she finished, long enough for her to feel the weight of it. She filled that space quickly. She reframed. She explained. She softened the edges of what she'd done, recasting choices as reactions. She referenced stress, confusion, growth. The words were familiar. They'd worked before. This time, they floated. When I spoke, it was brief. I said I'd already adjusted to how things were. I said I wasn't confused about what I wanted. I said nothing about Evan. Nothing about proof. Nothing about timelines or intent. That omission rattled her. She asked if I was done. Not angrily. Carefully. Like someone testing thin ice. She needed a definitive answer to push against. I didn't give her one. I told her I wasn't negotiating my position anymore. She tried to step closer then, physically and emotionally. She reminded me of history, of shared effort, of everything we'd built. She expected recognition, gratitude, something to anchor to. I acknowledged the past without re-entering it. The shift in her was visible. The control she'd relied on evaporated, replaced by something rawer. She wasn't angry yet. She was afraid. Afraid that this version of me wasn't reachable through any lever she understood. She asked if there was someone else. The question slipped out unguarded. I told her that wasn't relevant. That was the moment it landed. Not because of what I said, but because of how little I said. She realized she was no longer at the center of the conversation. She wasn't even framing it anymore. The confrontation ended without resolution, without drama, and that unsettled her more than any argument ever had. The collapse didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded in fragments she couldn't control or stage. Evan disappeared first. Not dramatically. No final message. No explanation. His post slowed, then stopped. His name stopped circulating. Whatever momentum he'd been riding dissolved under the weight of his own exposure. She noticed when she reached for him and found nothing solid to hold. The man she'd used as a symbol turned out to be exactly what I'd warned her he was. That loss rattled her, but she still believed she had others. She reached out to friends she'd relied on for years. Some responded politely. Some didn't. A few offered vague sympathy without curiosity, the kind that signals distance without admitting it. She wasn't pushed out. She was gently stepped around. At work, her authority thinned. Campaigns stalled. Decisions she once made without challenge were suddenly reviewed. Someone else was added to meetings she used to lead alone. No one accused her of anything. They simply adjusted, the way organizations do when they sense instability. She came home carrying that weight, expecting the apartment to absorb it. Instead, she found me unchanged. I moved through my days with precision. Meetings held. Deals closed. Travel planned. My life continued forward without referencing hers. The contrast became unbearable. She was unraveling inside a world that no longer reflected her importance, while I operated inside one that no longer required her presence. That was when the memories started to surface for her. Not the dramatic ones. The small, sharp details she'd ignored. How I'd handled crises without raising my voice. How I'd supported her ambitions without asking for credit. How the stability she'd grown bored of had been engineered quietly, deliberately. She began to see those moments not as background, but as structure. One evening, she stood in the doorway of my office and watched me work. She didn't interrupt. She didn't speak. The realization hit her without ceremony. The ground she'd been standing on had been built by someone she no longer had access to. She tried to recover control through vulnerability. She admitted she felt lost, that things hadn't gone the way she expected, that she didn't recognize her own life anymore. I listened. I didn't move toward her. I didn't console. I didn't correct her version of events. Her collapse wasn't loud. It was quiet, internal, and irreversible. And for the first time, she understood that I wasn't the one who'd left. I was the one she could no longer reach. The final moment didn't announce itself. There was no countdown, no dramatic reveal. It arrived the way real endings do, disguised as another quiet exchange that couldn't be undone. She approached me differently this time. No strategy, no framing, no attempt to steer the outcome. Whatever armor she'd relied on was gone, stripped away by weeks of losing ground without understanding why. She didn't ask for explanations anymore. She asked for proximity. She said she finally understood what she'd broken, not in abstract terms, but in consequence. She spoke about watching everything fall apart once I stopped holding it together. She admitted the break had never been about space. It had been about control, about provoking a reaction she could measure herself against. She didn't cry. She didn't dramatize it. That made it harder to dismiss. I listened until she was done. When I spoke, I didn't revisit the past. I didn't list injuries or recount moments she'd failed. I didn't raise my voice or soften it. I told her I'd already rebuilt my life in a way that didn't depend on her understanding. I told her the version of me she was talking to existed because I'd stopped negotiating my value. She asked what that meant for us. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence do what it needed to do. She waited, completely open now, without defenses or angles left to play. That was new, and it mattered. I told her I wasn't leaving out of anger. I told her I wasn't staying out of obligation. I told her that if anything continued between us, it would exist under conditions she didn't get to rewrite later. No leverage, no tests, no controlled chaos disguised as growth. She nodded. Slowly. She understood that this wasn't reconciliation as she'd known it before. This wasn't a return. It was a restart that didn't belong to her. I didn't reach for her. I didn't promise anything beyond clarity. I stood, collected my keys, and paused at the door long enough for the weight of the moment to settle. She thought the break would break me. It didn't. I didn't disappear. I just stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. Been through it. When they crossed a line, and you made sure they felt it.